Dear friends, Kedarji's absence has left a deep void in Hindi poetry as well as in my personal life, as our camaraderie goes back to 1980 when we first met at Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal during an Asian Poetry Festival. Since then, we have met in umpteen places inside and outside India. And after I moved to Delhi in 1992, our mutual acquaintance turned into genuine intimacy. I have neither the time nor the inclination to dwell at length on our relationship or Kedarji's poetry, as I do not want to encroach upon my dear friend Uday Prakash's assigned territory. The first thing that attracted me to him was the absolute similitude between the man and the poet. They were practically one and the same. His poetry was as austere, simple, profound as the man himself, a quality I seldom find among writers in any language. It may be true that his poetry got a little urbanized, sophisticated, maybe, as he spent a good part of his life as a teacher in Delhi. But his roots were in his earlier years spent in the village. That villager, with his rural acquaintances, memories, and landscapes, remained evergreen in his mind as well as in his poetry. Benares, Varanasi, is not just the name of one of his poems, but a subdued and permanent presence in his poetry. And so is Gorakhpur, even when he does not name it. His love of the village and its milieu was more than a city dweller's nostalgia. His soul mostly belonged there, and his images came from the rustic scenery and workplaces, a tradition that takes him back to and takes us also back to Kabir, who was one of Kedarji's favorites, along with others like Surdas or Kalidas or Mirza Ghalib, or to come to more recent times, Firaq Gorakhpuri, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Nirala, Muktibodh, Jivanananda Das, Baudelaire, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Ted Hughes, Pavlo Neruda, Evtushenko, Voznesensky, Dylan Thomas, or Wisława Szymborska, to name just a few of his favorite poets, as I gather from our frequent conversations. Yet, after every tour of world poetry, he would return to Kabir, who he knew like the palm of his hand. There must have been something common to us, especially as poets, who were born in small places and later moved to a big city. One of the first things he did after I moved to Delhi was to translate one of my poems called House, in his translation, Khar, from my series of poems on Delhi titled Dilli Dali. While I had already translated many of his poems, including Benares, The Carpenter and the Bird, an argument about horses, the broken truck, and quite a few others into Malayalam when I worked on a fellowship from Bharat Bhavan. And later, I translated many of the poems that came after these poems, and they were translated into English before he passed away for a collection of his poems that I had edited for the Sahitya Academy, which was published with a beautiful and detailed introduction by my friend Harish Trivedi. He released two of my collections for various publishers. I mean, my collections in Hindi translation, and wrote also an insightful introduction to one of these two. I have a poem dedicated to him, and he has one titled Hindi, which he dedicated to me. And my own translations from his later poetry include some portions from the Bagh, then 1947, recording 1947, and also quite a few others like Between the Needle and the Thread, and such later poems included in his collections that came out in the latter part of his poetic career. Personal relationship apart, Kedarji's poetry has always fascinated me with the freshness of images created from day-to-day objects like the spade and the needle, the loom and the bread, and natural objects, and belongs alike, and also natural beings like wood, the sun, the horse, and the bird. And secondly, the defamiliarizing of the familiar that generally retains its earthiness, even when at times they get transported into a surreal realm. Then the unlabored simplicity of his idiom, even while conveying profound ideas, and his deliberate preference for common Hindustani, an unpremeditated act of political relevance now, his use of simple, unique strategy of arranging lines, breaking up complex sentences into simple lines, or only using simple lines which never needed any kind of punctuation, or which made punctuation totally superfluous, which was one of the characteristics of his poetry. If you look at his poetry in print, you will find practically no punctuation. The lines just run on, only they are broken, and turned into units of meaning. And then the deep contemplativeness that never appears overtly philosophical, the subtle humor and irony that at times he turns upon himself, the products of a kind of distancing, the unconscious intertextuality produced by many suggestive allusions, the sustained concern for ordinary folk like peasants, workers, hawkers, and others, and even for trees, birds, and animals. And then the total absence of loudness, rawness, and rancor, which are unfortunately the curses of a lot of so-called progressive poetry, nor in his statements, but in his poetics. And that is where we need to seek his politics, not in the surface of his poetry, nor the public pronouncements that he made, but in the poetics that is implied in his practice. In my close study of two of his well-known poems, Tuta Hua Truck and Kudal, I have looked at the poet's search for a balanced vision and a rural-urban connect ever kept alive in his poetry. And this is particularly true about Kudal, which he finds in a city house, which suddenly brings the village into the city. Whenever I think of Kedarji's poetry, I recall the words of Pablo Neruda. These are the words, and there are, of course, it's a long quotation. I read just two sentences from that. I have always wanted the hands of people to be seen in my poetry. I have always preferred a poetry of loam where the water can sing, a poetry of bread where everyone may eat. Kedarji combined political and aesthetic, though it is hard to, and the political and aesthetic impulses of both the Prayogvadis, the experimental poets, and also the Pragadivadis or the progressives. Even though it is hard to label him as either, you cannot just call him a Prayogvadi or call him a Pragadivadi. There were elements of both kinds of poetry beautifully combined in most of his poems. And then his collections, right from Dharati, Abhi Bilkul Abhi, Zameen Pak Raha Hai, to later collections like Yahan Se Dekho, Akal Mein Saras, Uttar Kabir, Bagh, Tolstoy or Cycle, and Srishti Par Pehre have an interconnectedness and integrity that marks him out as a rare poet of our time. Not just a rare Hindi poet, but a rare poet of our time. We miss him very much in these dark times, that he would have illumined and lightened with his laughter and with the light and levity of his poetry. My homage to one of the finest poets of our age.